For our Wednesday night Bible study, and very unusual situation, isn't it, these days? And we hope our technology works, but Pastor Doug is going to be recording this, and if it doesn't show up well on the live feed, it will be available to you later on. Pastor Doug does the best he can, you know. The only problem I have with him is that in staff meeting yesterday morning, he reassured me that I have the perfect face for radio. So I don't know, whether you folks will stay tuned in here or not, but if there's any problem, let him know. And if that offends you, just let him know, okay? Because this is what I got and this is what you're going to get. Last week I explained why I was going to study the life of Joseph. I looked at Psalms, I looked at other things, I looked at Philippians, I looked at other things that I could possibly study. And because I have lots of studies right here on this laptop, and so I just update them and go through them and review them, and I can use a lot of different things. And more I thought about the life of Joseph because of the word that I picked to depict his life. So much of it could be defined as uncertainty. That was my key word last week. And I pointed out that his life divides into three parts. From birth to 17 years of age, his family was on the move. Well, that was a certain amount of uncertainty. But from 17 years to 30 years, Joseph's life was full of uncertainty because he was sold as a slave. He was taken down to Egypt, and then he was falsely accused. And that's what we're going to look at tonight, by the way, as part of this. But just remember, before we wrap this up, I just want to reassure all of us, we are in times of a lot of uncertainty right now, but we have a God who's still in control. Many years ago, I used to listen to the Back to the Bible broadcast coming out of Lincoln, Nebraska, and some of you probably were able to do that too. When I was a minister of music in Florida, one Sunday we brought in their male quartet to give a concert. I used to love hearing that quartet. They sang a song that has become one of my absolute favorites of all time. I want to play it now to set our minds on where we're going tonight, and I might have it played again at the end. We'll just see how time goes, all right? But the song is called Build Your Faith. The idea is build your faith before the uncertain times come. So let's listen to these men sing, and let's see if we can get this message into our minds first, all right?
The faith on which you stand is just as strong as its foundation. If it's on the rock, the winds of life won't blow it down. But if it's built upon the sand, when the storm comes, you'll be shaken. You'll be looking for a place to stand on solid ground. But if you build your faith before the walls start breaking, build your faith before the earth starts shaking, build your faith before the storm gets out of control. If you build your faith upon God's foundation, then you'll still be standing when the storm is raging. Build your faith on the Lord and you'll have peace in your soul. To those who trust in Him, God gives the calm assurance that whatever comes, His love will always stay secure. So if your hope is getting dim, remember He provides endurance to take you safely through each storm and keep your footing sure. So if you build your faith before the walls start breaking, build your faith before the earth starts shaking, build your faith before the storm gets out of control. If you build your faith upon God's foundation, then you'll still be standing when the storm is raging. Build your faith on the Lord and you'll have peace in your soul. Build your faith upon God's God's foundation, and you'll still be standing when the storm is raging. Build your faith on the Lord, and you'll have peace in your soul. Build your faith on the Lord, and you'll have peace in your soul. Build your faith on the Lord, and you'll have peace in your soul.
Well, I think you can probably tell from the message of that song why I like it so much. And you know, we don't know what life is going to bring our way. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to study Joseph's life, because of the things that went on in his life, very difficult times. And this is going to be one of them. So we're going to go to Genesis chapter 39. And this will be, last week we were in chapter 37, and we saw the family conflicts and the friction and everything that went on there. And we saw that his brothers sold him. In fact, here are the paragraphs I'm going to look at in this chapter, all right? We will see, first of all, Potiphar's trust. Then we will go, in the second paragraph, we will see Mrs. Potiphar's lust. Not a pretty picture, but it's the reality of what Joseph had to face at this time. In the third paragraph, we will see Mrs. Potiphar's accusation. And this is where things really go downhill for Joseph. And what we're going to find out is there is really no reason for what Joseph had to go through from a human perspective. And then we'll see Potiphar's reaction to that. And finally, after that, we will see God's mercy. So let me go to these first 6 verses, and I'd like to read this paragraph for us before we walk our way through it. All right? This is Genesis 39, verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put in his hand. So it was from that time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. So he, Potiphar, left all that he had in Joseph's hand. And he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate, and Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. The story of Joseph picks up with what we just saw at the end of chapter 37, and that's where we were last week. And that 36th verse says this: Now the Midianites had sold him to Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. What we see at the beginning of chapter 39 is, it is reiterated to us that he was taken down to Egypt, reiterated to us that he was bought by Potiphar, and you'll notice the sellers in verse 1 of chapter 39 are referred to as Ishmaelites. However, if you go back to 37, 36, you'll see that they are referred to as Midianites. Now, I could go into a partial explanation of why we would see that difference there, but let's leave it at this, that these terms are synonymous, all right? Ishmael Ishmael was born to Hagar, Abraham's other wife. And the Midian was born from Keturah. That was his wife after Sarah died. So there is a reason why the names interchange. We'll just leave it for they're the same group, okay? They're Midianites and or Ishmaelites. What we need to realize is that this time in the history of Egypt, it was highly civilized and an extremely well-organized empire. It was the empire of the world. Unfortunately, at the same time, it was very polytheistic and very immoral. So now, who was this Potiphar? Well, we're given some information about him. We're told he is an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the king's bodyguard. I doubt you could get much higher than that in Pharaoh's administration. If you had one person you wanted to be able to fully trust, it would be the person who is the head of your group of bodyguards. I notice, though, did you pick up on this? For some reason or other, there is emphasis in this passage that Potiphar was an Egyptian. I saw it in verse 1. He's the captain of the guard, and then you get a little parenthesis here, an Egyptian. I see it at the end of verse 2, his master, the Egyptian. I see it again down in verse 5. It might even be in there another time. In fact, verse 5 says, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house. I think it's a little puzzling that it would be such an emphasis on this. I'll tell you a brief explanation without going into all the details of this, too. Ancient Egyptian history is hard to find and hard to decipher. But in the middle of their lengthy history, we have record of a Hyksos invasion. These were people apparently who came in from Asia, and they usurped the throne, then they took over. And remember, Egypt is arranged in dynasties. The Hyksos were essentially the 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties. But they were usurpers. By the time of the Exodus, and Joseph was there in the 17th, so he was there under the Hyksos. By the time of the Exodus, however, the Hyksos had been replaced with true Egyptians, and that is why there was a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. So we are at a period of time, there's a major transition that's taking place here. And Joseph is coming in to that particular time of Egyptian history. Now, the main reason for Joseph's success, it's stated for us several places. Verse 2 tells us the Lord was with Joseph. And in fact, God saw to it that he was elevated to a very high position. Here it says he was a man in the house of the master of the Egyptian. Not everybody got to be in Potiphar's house, so Joseph was in a special position. Now, here's what his master saw about him in verse 3. His master saw that the Lord was with him. We read in verse 2 that the Lord was with him. It was obvious to Potiphar, according to verse 3. Makes me wonder, did Joseph ever give him verbal testimony? Well, there's no record of it if he did or not, but what Potiphar saw in the life and character of Joseph, he saw that Joseph was far more than just a normal individual. He had something very, very special about him. So he elevated him to be his estate manager, according to verse 4. Overseer of his house, personal assistant, estate manager. You can't get any higher than that. And then in verse 5, we are told that because Joseph was in that position, God blessed everything Potiphar had. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Not only in his house, but in his field. Not everywhere where Joseph worked, but everywhere in Potiphar's entire estate, God blessed simply because Joseph was in that position doing that job. Verse 6a says this is how much Pharaoh trusted him. Potiphar trusted him. He left all that he had in Joseph's hand. He didn't even know what he ate. He didn't know what he had except what he ate. And the verse ends with a, oh, by the way, little observation here, all right? And NIV at the end of verse 6 says it this way. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. But I read this in the Living Bible, and it gives us a pretty good picture. So Potiphar gave Joseph the complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. He hadn't a worry in the world with Joseph there. Wow, what a reputation, huh? Except to decide what he wanted to eat. By the way, Joseph, was a very handsome young man, was just added at the end of this verse. Now let's just make some other observations about Joseph, all right? Joseph was obviously highly intelligent, and personable. As far as we can tell, he was well liked by almost everybody, though I'm going to point out there might have been some who were not quite that excited about him. A man of highest integrity. We see that in his dedication to doing the best job possible for his boss, Potiphar. There is no evidence that he had any problem with pride. He was just diligent in everything he did, no matter what the circumstances. If we went to those New Testament verses, we would find that they all indicate that a man or a woman who is trustworthy in little things can then be entrusted with bigger things. That's the kind of man Joseph was. And those verses would explain that to us. So, through both humiliating and difficult times, Joseph continually maintained confidence in his God, and his testimony probably made unbelievers admire him. It certainly did Potiphar anyway. Proverbs 22:29 says this, "Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before unknown men." Now, do you see how good everything looks for Joseph at this point in time? In spite of the fact that he has been sold and he was bought in the slaves market, things couldn't be too much better, could they, under the circumstances? My New King James Study Bible says this, Joseph's brothers probably expected he'd be sold as a common laborer in a heavy construction project. Such heavy physical labor under harsh conditions could make a young man's life short. They probably never, ever had a single thought about ever seeing him again. Yet, because of God's mercy, Joseph was not sold as a common laborer in a heavy construction project. Joseph was sold to a rich, important, royal official. God's doing all right for him, huh? This is looking good. I want you to think about this, though. This is a universal truth. Greater measures of success will often lead to greater measures of trust from other people, which will often lead to greater opportunity for liberty in the life of the worker, which can lead, however, to greater opportunity for temptation. That's just the truth that we need to be aware of, but as we are going to see, this will not be so in the life of Joseph. All right, let me read this next paragraph, verses 7 through 10. Now it came to pass after these things, everything's really been good so far, huh? Came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. Let's just summarize the facts quickly, all right? Step number 1, she looked longingly and with desire for Joseph. Let's just put it in plain English. She was lusting after him. Holman Old Testament Commentary says this, in his mid-20s, he was successful, he exercised great authority, he was unattached, and he was well-built and handsome. And Joseph would have been respectful and very polite to Potiphar's wife, which would have made him all the more appealing to her. The commentary goes on to say, many a man has responded in a chivalrous manner to a woman in need of attention. This was a real temptation because he was a red-blooded human male. Step 2, She openly invited Joseph to an immoral relationship. Now, it is probable that Potiphar's wife had done a little bit of flirting with Joseph and had been trying to get his attention, and maybe she realized that, being subtle with this guy, this ain't working. And so she decided that he is such a nice, gentlemanly person that she probably felt safe in approaching him with this suggestion straight out. So she was straightforward in saying, "Come to bed with me." That does say something good about Joseph, but now what's he going to face? So let's look at his response in verses 8 and 9, and let me summarize these statements that he made. Look, my master has such confidence, complete confidence in me, that he has entrusted me with everything he owns. And because of his trust, I'm the most powerful person in his house, and I have authority over everything he possesses. But you are his wife, and it would be wicked for me to be with you in that way. And besides that, he concludes, it would be sin against God. Do you know what I see in this argument as he walked through it? I think he was doing the very best he could to not offend this woman. He laid it out step by step, argument by argument. He was trying to be gentlemanly even at this point in time. So step 3, she refused to listen to his logic and plea for moral purity. And she revealed, therefore, her total insensitivity to right and wrong. And as Joseph is dealing with her, trying to be a gentleman, the gentleman that he probably really was at all times, he suddenly realized, I can't do this way. This is not going to work. And so, when she became persistent, you see the phrase? She spoke to Joseph day by day. She didn't just speak to him. She was trying to allure him day after day after day. Have you ever heard this saying? Hell has no fury like a woman scorned. Think that through just a little bit. I don't want this to be offensive to any women who might be watching this, but the meaning of the phrase is this. There's nothing as unpleasant as a woman who has been offended or whose love has not been returned. I understand that's exactly what that means. So Joseph, look out, because you have just scorned and offended a powerful woman. Henry Morris, written a big commentary on the whole book of Genesis. Joseph refused her invitation, strong though the temptation may have been. Potiphar's wife, however, was not persuaded by Joseph's good and proper reasoning, but continued day after day trying to attract him to her bed. Joseph not only continued to refuse, but began to avoid her altogether, trying not even to be with her, according to the end of that verse. Now, how could he do this? It's a good lesson here for us. He was honorable in that he recognized and respected his master's trust in him. He knew that Potiphar had total and complete, utter confidence in him as a person, not only as a man who would do his job well, but in his character, in the person he was. He was a man of integrity in that he knew it would be wrong to be involved with another man's wife. And he was sensitive to sin in that he knew that such an activity also then would be wicked in God's eyes, in the sight of God. That's the way we can explain how he could resist. By the way, you remember the song I played? Build your faith before the walls start breaking. Build your faith before the earth starts shaking. Build your faith before the storms get out of control. This says to me that if Joseph was not a man of absolute, utter faith in his God, he might not have passed this test. But he did, because he had prior to this developed a relationship with his father's God. Joseph didn't say, I'd be hurting you, or no, I'd be sinning against Potiphar, or, well, I'd be sinning against myself. Under pressure, such excuses are easily rationalized away. Take note, gentlemen. Remember that sexual sin is not just between two consenting adults. It is an act of disobedience against God. And we've got to look at it that way if we are to resist the kind of temptations Joseph faced. Scene number 1. Let's read verses 11 through 18. This is the next paragraph. Genesis 39, verse 11. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice." I'm going to explain a little bit what the method in her madness right there. "And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until her master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. So it happened as I lifted my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside.'" Now let me tell you something. There's a lot of psychology going on in this woman's mind in this whole scene. First of all, nobody was in the house that day. Those are the facts. She grabbed him and begged him to take her. Maybe she thought if she could just get him in her embrace one time, then his desires would kick in, and if he would give in once, then he would be there repeatedly. Joseph had only one recourse to the situation because it was extremely dangerous. I'm going to take time to go to Proverbs chapter 5. Now, I regularly teach CBM interns over in Tennessee, and we do a few studies in the book of Proverbs. There are some studies that I do only if there are men in the class. And this is one of them. I just came back from teaching over there a couple of weeks ago, and this is one of the passages that it didn't really pertain that much to the girls who were the class. "My son, pay attention to my wisdom, lend your ear to my understanding, that you may preserve discretion and that your lips may keep knowledge. For the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil." Do you see Mrs. Potiphar in there? "But in the end she is bitter as wormwood." Do you see her in there? "Sharp as a two-edged sword, her feet go down to death, her steps lay hold of hell. Lest you ponder her path of life, her ways are unstable, and you do not know them. Therefore hear me, my children. Do not depart from the words of my mouth. Remove your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the cruel one." That's what Joseph was doing. His only option was to run. Chuck Swindoll, one of my very favorite Bible teachers. Whenever the New Testament lingers on the subject of sensual temptation, it gives us one command: run. The Bible does not tell us to reason with it. It does not tell us to think about it and claim verses. It tells us to flee. I have discovered you cannot yield to sensuality if you're running away from it. So run for your life, Swindoll says. Get out of there. If you try to reason with lust or play around with sensual thoughts, you will finally yield. You can't fight it. That's why the Spirit of God forcefully commands, run. Now, does that therefore not say to us again, the character of Joseph was strong, and that he already had a relationship with God that gave him insight that would be far deeper? You know, he was only 17 when he was sold. And so this is still within those early years. What is he? Is he up 20 by now? We don't know for sure. But he was a young man. So scene number 2, in reaction to her humiliation and to get even with Joseph, she lied about what had happened. First, she called in the other servants and gave them the story. She referred to Joseph as this Hebrew. Now, in her context, that was a racial term. It was degrading. This Hebrew, and said, he's been brought in to mock us all. Now, don't you know, there were probably some Egyptian servants who were already a little bit jealous because he had been elevated. Here's this Jewish boy who's been elevated to this high position in Pharaoh's house. So it wasn't too hard for her to convince them that he was one bad dude. Then she lied about his intentions and claimed that she had cried out with a loud voice. Boy, from what we just read, we know this whole thing is fabricated, don't we? And then she said she lied about his fleeing because of her crying out. None of that makes any sense. Dr. Morris said this, at that point, the passionate desire of Potiphar's wife suddenly turned into the rage of a woman scorned. Knowing that her desire for Joseph was now completely impossible, her only thought was to humiliate him as deeply as possible for his rejection of her. Joseph's garment was still in her hand. She knew it would be interpreted as evidence incriminating her unless she quickly took the initiative by accusing him. And so, scene number 3. She carefully calculated a way to get her husband to harshly punish Joseph. Let's read verse 16 again. She kept his garment and with her until his master came home. And then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. So it happened as I lifted my voice and cried out, he left his garment with me and fled outside. She kept Joseph's garment, and again, not only referred to him as the Hebrew servant, but she humiliated her own husband by laying the blame on him. It's your own fault. You brought this Hebrew servant in here, made him part of our household. There's no business in having him in here. And now, this servant that you brought in, this Hebrew servant that you brought in, came to mock me. And then again, her fabricated story says that she cried out and he ran, leaving his garment behind. Potiphar's wife treated Joseph in a humiliating way by inviting him into her bed. She may have reasoned, after all, isn't he a Jew and a slave at that? And doesn't he work for my husband and therefore also work for me? Since my husband isn't here, I'm in charge and Joseph is my employee. It's his job to take orders. She treated Joseph like a thing, not like a person. And when her advances were rejected, she turned against him. Did you ever realize that this is the second time Joseph's clothing was used to bring a false report about him? In both cases, he had been doing nothing more than faithfully serving. In the first case, he was serving his father when he went to check up on his older brothers, as his father asked him to do. And they, after they had sold him, put that colorful garment and dipped it in blood and took it to Jacob and falsely accused him. Now this second time, his outer garment, his clothing again, was used against him. Both times he ended up in bondage. Now, is that fair of God to allow that? Here's the situation. She had the robe and she had the power. So what could Joseph do? It just doesn't seem right, does it? Surely God will now reward Joseph for taking such a strong stand against sin. That should please God so much that He'll go beyond the call of duty and protect him, right? Wrong. Doesn't appear like He did. Now, ended up with Potiphar being angry. Let me read these two verses that are Potiphar's reaction. Verse 19. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, Your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. I ask you this question. At whom do you suppose Potiphar's anger was directed? It does not say his wrath was against Joseph. And this could have been reason for Joseph to be executed, and for him to simply be thrown in prison was a far too light punishment for a powerful man like Potiphar, the head of Pharaoh's guard. That should have been an instant decapitating, off with his head. But you know what I think? I think Potiphar knew his wife, and he knew Joseph. And something about this story did not equate or compute. I personally think his anger was as much against his wife as it would have been against anybody. But surely God will reward Joseph for his faithfulness, right? No. He was thrown into prison. Notice there's no evidence that Joseph made any attempt to defend himself. Well, think it through. Maybe he felt sorry for her. I mean, he's a tender-hearted guy. She was deprived by him and taken for granted by her husband, maybe, and by others. Maybe he realized that defense from a slave wouldn't have any worth anyway, so why bother? So apparently he stayed silent, like Jesus did in front of his accusers. That would say to me that we have an evidence of spiritual maturity way beyond Joseph's years. Prisons were used to house forced laborers, or like Joseph, the accused who were awaiting trial. Prisoners were guilty until proven innocent. There was no right to a speedy trial. Many prisoners never made it to court because trials were held at the whim of the ruler. Joseph was in prison 2 years until he appeared before Pharaoh, and then he was called out to interpret a dream, not to stand trial. So let's go to the last paragraph. Verse 21, But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's hand, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Sounds to me like the same song, the second verse, doesn't it? Here he is going down to another level, but while he is there, the Lord is still with him. I heard Dr. Tony Evans preach on this passage one time. When he came to this point, he said to us this: Do you ever wonder if Joseph might have thought, Lord, can you just go be with somebody else for a while? I'm going down, and you're with me. I'm going down, you're with me. I'm going down, you're with me. But that's not terribly encouraging and comforting. But did you notice verse 21? Verse 21 says he showed him mercy. And I think it's probably explained in the rest of that verse, because the prison keeper noticed Joseph's good attitude and his sense of integrity. And so he put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. Well, whoop-de-doo. Like Potiphar, the prison keeper left everything up to Joseph. He didn't concern himself with the details anymore. And once again, that says a great deal to us about Joseph's character, doesn't it? He too, that prison keeper, saw that the Lord was with Joseph, and that made him completely trustworthy. And so these two situations reveal to us, both in Potiphar's house and now in prison, the promise of God in Genesis 12:3 that says, I will bless those who bless you. And so Potiphar was blessed immensely because he blessed Joseph, and now the prison keeper too. So far, Joseph's life appears to be in a downward spiral in spite of his faithfulness to God. How can this be? Well, we know the end of the story, of course. We know that God is preparing him for a huge leadership role, but he didn't know it at the time. So how could he continue to maintain such a great attitude and trust in God? It has to go back to his foundational belief. Build your faith before the walls start breaking. Build your faith before the earth starts shaking. Build your faith before the storms get out of control. And Dr. Constable says, success in temptation depends more on character than on circumstances. Character rests on commitment to the will of God. We can see Joseph's character in his loyalty to Potiphar concerning what his master had entrusted to his care. We also see it in his responsibility to God for what belonged to somebody else. It is further obvious in his responsibility to God respecting his special personal calling. It's the character of Joseph. And it's what he had decided to be for God and with God before he faced all of this. So, Pastor Doug, can we bring that song up and conclude that way? You got it. All right. You're a good man, even if you did say my face is perfect for radio. Yeah, see, he even admits it, doesn't he? Build your faith. Let's listen to these words one more time.
The faith on which you stand,
The foundation.
is just as strong as its foundation. If it's on the rock, the winds of life won't blow it down. But if it's built upon the sand, when the storm comes, you'll be shaken. You'll be looking for a place to stand on solid ground. But if you build your faith before the walls start breaking, build your faith before the earth starts shaking, build your faith before the storm gets out of control. If you build your faith upon God's foundation, then you'll still be standing when the storm is raging. Build your faith on the Lord and you'll have peace in your soul. To those who trust in Him, God gives the calm assurance that whatever comes, His love will always stay secure. So if your hope is getting dim, remember He provides endurance to take you safely through each storm and keep your footing sure. So if you build your faith before the walls start breaking, build your faith before the earth starts shaking, build your faith before the storm gets out of control. If you build your faith upon God's foundation, then you'll still be standing when the storm is raging. Build your faith on the Lord and you'll have peace in your soul. Build your faith upon God's foundation and you'll still be standing when the storm is raging. Build your faith on the Lord and you'll have peace in your soul. Build your faith on the Lord and you'll have peace in your soul. Build your faith on the Lord and you'll have peace in your soul.
One of the reasons we admire Joseph is his faithfulness. D. Menon, in an article entitled How the Wise Man Overcomes Temptation, states of Joseph, in duty he was loyal, in temptation he was strong, and in prison he was faithful. What a life to imitate. Joseph was not surrounded by his family, a church, or devout friends. He did not have a copy of the Scriptures since they were not yet written. But he did have the medium of prayer and the remembrance of the promises of God that had come to him in his dreams, and perhaps in conversations with his father Jacob years before. For Joseph, knowing God and his character was enough for him to be loyal in duty, strong in resisting temptation, and faithful even in unfair circumstances. Maybe I could say even in uncertain circumstances like we're in today. Dear Heavenly Father, I lift my heart to you just now, and I thank you for an example like this in Scripture. The temptation was very real, it was very prolonged, it was very strong. We have a young man who had built his faith upon the firm foundation of God. How he learned that much about you, we don't know. Jacob apparently did a good job of teaching his son. But what an example for us to imitate. So in our days of uncertainty right now, increase our ability to trust you, I pray. And do not let the enemy cause us to doubt in all these circumstances. And we thank you for your willingness to help us. In Jesus' name, amen.